Fire needs three things: fuel, air, and height. Elspeth Blackwood learned that watching her husband freeze to death 100 feet from where she stood now, rope in hand, measuring the brick chimney that rose through the center of her cabin like a tombstone. June heat pressed against the Wyoming grassland, sage and dust, mixing in the wind that never stopped moving across this territory. The cabin sat alone in a clearing carved from scrub oak and juniper, 16 feet by 20, built by Silas 3 summers back when they'd filed the claim and believed survival meant strong walls and a good roof. The chimney red brick mortared tight, Silas's best work, pierced through the cabin's peak and climbed another 6 feet into empty sky. Elspeth wrapped the rope around its base at ground level, marking where the circle closed. 12 feet in circumference, 4 feet in diameter. Perfect. She knelt in the dirt with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper torn from last year's almanac sketching lines that made sense only to her. The cabin in profile, small and square. The chimney rising through its center. And around that chimney, something no one in the valley had seen before: a circular tower 12 feet tall, built around the existing brick like a wooden sleeve. 3 levels of platforms spiraling upward. A conical roof crowned with metal. A staircase winding around the outside. Ember, the golden retriever Silas had brought home as a pup 3 years ago, sat in the shade of the cabin's north wall, panting. The dog watched everything Elspeth did these days with brown eyes that seemed to understand grief better than most humans. The sketch showed storage cords of firewood stacked on each platform, drying in the heat that rose from the chimney below. Not just storage. Active seasoning. The warmth climbing through the tower would pull moisture from green wood faster than any amount of air and time alone. Bottom platform for fresh-cut logs still heavy with sap. Middle platform for half-dried. Top platform for fuel ready to burn, light as bone, hot enough to ignite with a single match. Elspeth had spent the winter doing mathematics by candlelight, while Silas's body grew cold in the frozen ground behind the barn, waiting for spring thaw and a proper burial. She'd measured the temperature at different heights inside the cabin, tracked how heat moved, calculated how much faster wood would dry if stored in rising warmth instead of sitting in a shed where moisture pooled and rot took hold. The sound of hooves pulled her attention west. A rider emerged from the tree line, moving at the relaxed pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. Thaddeus Mercer, her nearest neighbor, his homestead 3 miles through the valley. He'd been a widower for 2 years now, his wife and infant son buried on a hillside Elspeth had visited once to pay respects she barely felt. Grief made neighbors of people who might otherwise have remained strangers. Thad reined in his sorrel gelding 20 feet from where she knelt. Dust settled around the horse's legs. He was a tall man, lean from work and rationed meals, maybe 35, with the kind of face that looked older than its years because it had seen things that aged a person from the inside. His eyes moved from Elspeth to the sketch to the chimney and back. "You planning something, Elspeth?" She stood brushing dirt from her skirt, the charcoal still in her hand. The sketch remained on the ground where anyone passing could see it. Building a tower, around the chimney, 12 feet high. 3 levels for wood storage. Thad dismounted, looping the reins over a fence post that held nothing but air and intention. He walked closer, squinting at the drawing. "A tower. Around your chimney." His tone carried the careful neutrality of a man trying not to call a woman crazy to her face. Elspeth pointed at the sketch with the charcoal leaving a dark smudge on the already stained paper. "Chimney heat rises, wasted heat going straight up and disappearing. If I build platforms around it, stack firewood on those platforms, the rising warmth dries the wood from the center out. Green wood becomes seasoned in half the time, maybe less." Thad crouched beside the sketch, studying it the way a man studies something he doesn't understand but suspects might be dangerous. "Nobody builds a tower around their chimney, Elspeth. You'd have to build the foundation without damaging the brick. Set posts around it. Create platforms that don't interfere with the structure. Then there's the roof. How do you cap a tower with a chimney running through the middle of it?" "Metal cap. I'll forge it myself. Vent holes for the smoke. Overhang to keep rain off the wood. The whole thing spiral staircase on the outside, access to each level. 50 cords of wood if I build it right. Dry wood, ready to burn. Thad straightened, wiping his hands on his pants, though they'd touched nothing but air. That's a lot of work for firewood, Elspeth. Why not just build a better woodshed? Put it closer to the house, because Silas died 100 feet from our door. The words came out flat, final, and Thad's expression shifted from skepticism to something more cautious. The whole valley believed fever had taken Silas Blackwood last November. Elspeth had let them believe it because the truth was harder to carry in public than in private. She picked up the sketch, holding it so Thad could see it clearly. Blizzard came through November 15th. 3 days of white so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Temperature dropped to 20 below. We had firewood inside, maybe half a cord, but it was wet, burning slow, smoking, barely keeping the cabin above freezing. Thad said nothing. Ember shifted in the shade, ears forward. Silas went to the barn to check the horses. We had 2 back then. Good animals. The barn was 100 feet from the cabin door. I measured it after. He made it there fine. Found the horses cold but alive. Decided to move them into the livestock shelter we'd built on the barn's south side, more protection from the wind. She paused, looking at the sketch instead of at Thad. He got the horses settled, started back to the cabin. 50 feet into the walk, he lost his bearings. The wind was pushing the snow horizontal. No landmarks. No tracks. They filled in behind you as fast as you made them. He walked in what he thought was a straight line toward home. The charcoal in her hand left marks on the paper's edge. I found him at dawn when the storm broke. Frozen solid against the barn door. He'd circled back without knowing it. Died holding the latch he'd locked himself out of 15 feet from warmth and shelter. Thad's jaw tightened. The wind moved through the grass around them, the only sound for a long moment. Jesus, Elspeth. I didn't know. No one knows. Let them think fever. Let them think it was God's will or bad fortune or any other comfortable lie that helps them sleep. She turned the sketch toward herself, looking at the tower she'd drawn. But I know the truth. Silas died because warmth was in only one place. If there had been heat in the barn, if we'd had a way to keep fire there safely, he could have survived the night, waited out the storm, come home when the wind died. This tower isn't about firewood, Thad. It's about making sure warmth is everywhere it needs to be. It's about never again having just one place to survive. Thad looked at the chimney, then at the sketch, then at Elspeth. His skepticism hadn't disappeared, but something else had joined it. Maybe respect. Maybe just the recognition that arguing with grief rarely accomplished anything useful. You really think you can build this yourself? My father was a blacksmith and carpenter in Norway. Taught me to work metal and wood before I was 12. I built half this cabin while Silas was too sick to stand. I can build a tower. Thad nodded slowly. It's going to draw talk. People are going to think. Let them think. Winter doesn't care what people think. Winter cares whether you have dry wood and fire that burns hot. Everything else is just noise. Thad mounted his horse, settling into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. If you need help raising anything too heavy for one person, come find me. Some things kill you if you try them alone. Thank you. I'll remember that. He rode off west, back toward his own homestead and whatever work waited there. Elspeth watched until he disappeared into the tree line, then turned back to the cabin and the chimney and the tower that existed only in charcoal and intention. Ember stood shaking dust from her coat and followed Elspeth toward the forest where timber waited to be cut. The work began the next morning with an axe and a clear sky. Elspeth walked into the scrub oak forest that bordered the eastern edge of her claim, Ember, ranging ahead through the underbrush, and selected the first tree. Straight trunk, 8 inches in diameter, 20 feet of clean wood before the branches started. She notched the trunk on the side facing the clearing, angling the cut, so gravity would pull the tree exactly where she wanted it to fall. The back cut came from the opposite side, precise and controlled, and when the tree began to lean, she stepped clear and let physics finish what she'd started. The crash sent birds scattering and Ember bounding back to investigate. Elspeth stripped the bark with a draw knife, working the blade along the trunk's length until pale wood emerged beneath. The repetition had a meditative quality. Pull, strip, move, forward, repeat. Her hands blistered despite the leather gloves she wore, but blisters healed and timber didn't cut itself. She needed posts first, 12 of them, each 10 feet long, to create the vertical structure around the chimney. The scrub oak provided 6, before she moved to the pine stand north of the cabin where taller trees grew in the rocky soil that held water better than the grassland. Pine for the posts, oak for the beams, whatever she could find for the platform planks and the spiral staircase that would wind around the outside. Each tree that fell was a small victory against the inertia of grief. Easier to swing an axe than sit still. Easier to measure and cut than remember Silas's face when she'd found him frozen ice in his beard, eyes open and unseeing. By the end of the first week she had 12 posts stripped and drying in the sun behind the cabin. Ember claimed the shade beneath them as her preferred resting spot, and Elspeth let her. The dog had been Silas's companion on hunting trips and fence repairs, had slept at the foot of their bed every night, had watched Elspeth bury her husband, and seemed to understand that some losses changed everything. The second week brought measurements and planning. Elspeth walked circles around the chimney with a ball of twine, marking distances, calculating angles, sketching modifications to her original design. The posts would stand 8 feet from the chimney's center, creating a 16-foot diameter circle. The first platform would sit 6 feet off the ground, the second at 9 feet, the third at 12. The spiral staircase would wrap counterclockwise, rising 1 foot of elevation for every 3 feet of horizontal travel. She spent an evening working her father's old forge heating iron rods and hammering them into brackets that would anchor the platforms to the chimney brick. The forge had come with them from Norway, disassembled and packed in 3 crates. Her father's legacy, along with his tools and the knowledge he'd hammered into her mind as thoroughly as he'd hammered metal into shape. The brackets glowed orange in the firelight, and Elspeth quenched them in oil, watching steam rise and twist. Each bracket had to be perfect. These would bear the weight of timber and firewood and the platform floors and anyone climbing the stairs to access the upper levels. Failure here meant collapse, meant death if someone was standing on a platform when it gave way. She made 18 brackets, then made 6 more because redundancy kept people alive. The sound of hoofbeats came again on a Saturday morning, but this time the rider wasn't Thad Mercer. Elspeth looked up from her work. She'd been drilling holes in the posts to accept crossbeams, and saw a man she recognized from town. Cyrus Whitmore, maybe 40, with the thick shoulders and scarred hands of someone who'd spent decades in construction. He was the valley's unofficial builder, the man people hired when they needed a barn raised or a house expanded or a bridge built across the creek that ran through the settlement. Cyrus reined in his horse and sat in the saddle, looking at the posts laid out in the grass, at the brackets cooling on the forge's edge, at Elspeth with her drill and her plans. "Heard you were building something. Thought I'd ride out and see if you needed proper help." His tone suggested he already knew the answer but wanted to hear her say it. Elspeth set down the drill, wiping her hands on a rag that was more oil than cloth. "I'm building a tower around my chimney, for wood storage and drying. I have the design worked out. Just need to execute it." Cyrus dismounted, walking closer to examine the posts. He ran a hand along one, checking the straightness, the quality of the cut. Tower around a chimney. That's ambitious for someone working alone. Ambitious for anyone, really. Never seen it done. That's why I'm doing it. He picked up one of the iron brackets, turning it in the light, examining the welds and the bolt holes. "You forge these yourself?" "My father taught me." Cyrus set the bracket down with more force than necessary, the metal ringing against the anvil's surface. "Look, Mrs. Blackwood, I respect initiative. But building something like this, something structural, something you're going to climb on and load with weight, that takes experience. Training. I've been building in this territory for 15 years. Let me take this project over. Do it properly. I'll charge you fair rates, give you a discount on account of your situation." His eyes flicked to the cabin, to the small plot behind it where Silas's grave marker stood visible against the grass. Elspeth picked up the drill again, positioning it over the next hole that needed to be made. "I appreciate the offer, Cyrus. But this design came from watching my husband die. From spending winter nights calculating heat distribution and wood seasoning rates and structural loads. Only I know what needs to happen here. Only I can build it." Cyrus's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. A dangerous one. When this thing collapses, and it will collapse, Mrs. Blackwood, because you don't have the experience to build something this complex, people are going to get hurt, maybe killed. Then I'll make sure it doesn't collapse." She met his eyes, holding his gaze until he looked away first. Cyrus mounted his horse without another word, but the look he gave the posts and brackets and cabin carried something darker than concern. Elspeth watched him ride back toward town and made a mental note to check her work twice as carefully from now on. Ember growled low in her throat the first time Elspeth had heard that sound since Silas died. Good girl. I don't trust him either. The foundation work started in early July. Elspeth dug a trench 3 feet deep in a perfect circle around the chimney, fighting through root systems and buried rock, every shovelful of dirt a negotiation with soil that didn't want to move. The trench would hold flat stones footings to distribute the tower's weight and prevent settling when spring thaw came. She'd hauled the stones from the creek bed over the course of 3 days, loading them onto a sledge. Ember helped pull 50 pounds at a time. Thad arrived on the 4th day of digging, drawn either by curiosity or concern, or the unspoken understanding that some jobs genuinely needed 2 people. He stood at the trench's edge looking down at the progress Elspeth had made. That's some serious excavation. How deep you planning to go? 3 feet. Down to stable soil. The tower's going to hold 20 cords at capacity. Maybe more. Foundation has to handle that weight plus snow load plus wind stress. Thad jumped down into the trench, and together they worked the southern section where roots from an old cottonwood had infiltrated the soil like fingers. The roots fought back, but they cut them away piece by piece, Thad with a hatchet and Elspeth with a pruning saw, until the trench completed its circle. Setting the stones took another week. Each one had to be level, stable positioned, so it would transfer load down into the earth without shifting. Elspeth used a wooden level her father had made, checking and rechecking, adding or removing soil beneath each stone until the bubble sat centered in its glass tube. Thad helped with the heavy lifting, and during the work they talked in the way people talk when their hands are busy and their minds can wander. "Your wife. Did you bury her on your claim?" Thad grunted, shifting a 100-pound stone into position. "Hillside north of my cabin. Faces east, gets morning sun. Figured she'd like that. She always woke early. Did it help?" Having her close. Thad didn't answer immediately, adjusting the stone's angle, checking it against the level. Helped with the grief. Harder on the guilt. Elspeth looked up from her own work. Guilt. About what? Surviving. Moving forward. Building a life that doesn't include her. The stones settled into place, and Thad climbed out of the trench to get another one. "That's why I keep coming here. Watching you build. You're not running from it, Elspeth. You're building something from it. That's different. That's better." The first platform brackets went into the chimney on a Tuesday morning when the air was still cool and Elspeth's hands were steady. She'd measured the brick-marking drill points with chalk, and now she worked with a hand drill and carbide bit, boring into the mortar between bricks. Slow work. Careful work. One mistake here and she'd crack the brick or compromise the chimney's integrity. The drill bit into mortar and dust fell in red streams. Ember watched from the shade, head on paws. The first hole went clean 3 inches deep. Elspeth inserted an iron bracket, tapping it home with a mallet until it sat flush against the brick. She drilled a second hole, inserted a second bracket, then a third. 6 brackets total for the first platform level, spaced evenly around the chimney's circumference. The platform beams came next, oak cut to precise lengths, notched at the ends to accept the brackets and lock into place. Thad arrived without being asked, and together they lifted the first beam, sliding it onto the brackets, checking it for level. The beam held. No creaking, no settling, just solid wood on solid metal on solid brick. They installed the remaining 5 beams, creating a hexagonal frame around the chimney 6 feet off the ground. Elspeth climbed a ladder and stepped onto the frame, testing it with her weight. The structure didn't move. She jumped once hard. Nothing shifted. Thad smiled from ground level. "You're either brilliant or insane, Elspeth. Haven't decided which yet. Can't it be both?" "Probably has to be." The platform floor went down in sections, planks cut from pine laid perpendicular to the beams, nailed at every intersection. By evening, the first level was complete. A solid hexagonal platform 6 feet off the ground, wrapped around the chimney like the first ring of a tree. Elspeth stood on it as the sun set, looking out over the grassland that stretched to the western horizon. From up here she could see Thad's homestead, smoke rising from his chimney 3 miles away. Could see the tree line where timber waited to be cut. Could see the future taking shape in iron and wood and intention. The discovery came 3 days later. Elspeth had climbed up to the first platform to check the bracket's routine inspection, making sure nothing had shifted overnight when she noticed one of the bolts looked different. The head was scratched fresh metal showing through the rust that had begun to form on the others. She touched it, and the bolt turned easily under her fingers. Too easily. She pulled it free, examining the threads. They'd been stripped, filed down, deliberately weakened. If she'd put weight on this section, if she'd started loading firewood onto the platform, the bracket would have failed. The beam would have collapsed. Anyone standing on it would have fallen 6 feet onto hard ground, maybe broken bones, maybe broken neck. Ember sat at the base of the ladder looking up. The dog barked once, sharp and urgent. Elspeth climbed down, holding the damaged bolt. She walked a circuit around the tower's base, looking for footprints, signs of disturbance. The soil had been dry for days, holding tracks. She found them on the north side, boot prints larger than hers, fresher than Thad's last visit. Someone had come during the night, had climbed her ladder, had deliberately sabotaged the bracket she'd installed. She thought of Cyrus Whitmore's face when she'd refused his help, thought of his warning that the tower would collapse, thought of how convenient it would be if he turned out to be right. Elspeth went to her toolbox and found replacement bolts, longer ones, thicker, with threads cut deep enough that no amount of filing would weaken them significantly. She installed them that afternoon, adding extra brackets she hadn't originally planned, reinforcing the platform beyond what her calculations required. If someone wanted to sabotage her work, they'd have to try harder. She told no one. Not Thad, not the neighbors who rode by to watch her progress, not Prudence Ashford, who'd made it her business to know everyone else's business in the valley. Elspeth simply worked, checked her work, checked it again, and slept with Ember inside the cabin and one eye on the window that faced the tower. The second and third platform levels went up through the rest of July. Same process as the first drill into the chimney, install brackets, lift beams, lay flooring. But now Elspeth worked with Thad's regular help, the two of them moving with the efficiency of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. He'd arrive after his own morning chores work until noon, ride home to tend his livestock, return in the late afternoon when the heat broke. They didn't talk much during the work. Didn't need to. Thad would position a beam and Elspeth would check it for level, and they'd secure it without discussion. The tower grew upward 12 feet from chimney base to the third platform, and with each level the view expanded. From the top platform, Elspeth could see nearly 10 miles in every direction, the whole valley spread out like a map. Prudence Ashford rode out one afternoon with her husband Thomas, drawn by rumors that had spread through town like smoke. She sat on her horse, looking up at the tower that now wrapped around the blackwood chimney in 3 distinct tiers. "Well, it hasn't fallen yet, I'll give you that." Thomas dismounted, walking a slow circle around the structure, examining the posts and beams and platform floors with the eye of someone who understood carpentry, even if he'd never attempted anything this ambitious. "This is solid work, Elspeth. Better than solid. Where'd you learn to build like this?" "My father, before we came to America." Prudence shifted in her saddle. "Your father taught you metal work, too. Those brackets look professional." "He was a blacksmith. Said I had the hands for it." Prudence's expression suggested she had opinions about women working forges, but she kept them to herself. Instead, she nodded at the tower. "What's it for exactly?" "All this timber and effort. Firewood storage. The chimney heat rises through the center, dries the wood from the inside out. Green wood seasons in half the time. Top platform will hold fuel ready to burn. Bottom platform takes fresh-cut logs. Middle platform is transition." Thomas walked closer to the chimney, looking up through the structure's open center where smoke would rise. "That's clever. Real clever. Heat that would just disappear into the sky, you're capturing it. Using it." Prudence frowned. "Still seems like a lot of work just to keep wood dry. Could have built a simple shed for half the effort." Elspeth looked at her, then at the tower, then back. A shed is 40 feet from the door. This is 5. In a blizzard, that difference keeps you alive. The silence that followed suggested Prudence understood more than she'd let on. She gathered her reins. "Well, I hope it works the way you planned." They rode away and Elspeth returned to work. The spiral staircase was next the element that had kept her awake multiple nights trying to solve. A staircase that curved, that rose 1 foot for every 3 feet of horizontal travel, that could bear weight without twisting or separating from the structure it served. She built it in sections, each piece small enough to lift alone, then assembled them in sequence. The treads were oak thick and solid. The risers were pine lighter, but strong. The whole assembly attached to the tower's outer posts with brackets she'd forged specially for the purpose, angled to accept the staircase's curve. The first section went up on the tower's east side, rising from ground level to the first platform. Elspeth tested it, climbing slowly, weight on the outside edge where the treads were widest. The stairs held. She climbed faster, jumped on the third step. Still solid. The second section curved from the first platform to the second, and the third section from the second platform to the top. By the time she finished, the staircase wrapped around the tower in a graceful ascending spiral, functional and elegant in equal measure. Thad climbed it that evening, testing each step, his weight distributed carefully until he reached the top platform and stood looking west toward his own land. "This is something, Elspeth. This is really something." She climbed up to join him, and for a moment they stood together 12 feet off the ground, the valley spread out below them, the sky opening up overhead. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "When you finish this, when winter comes and it works the way you planned, what happens then?" "Then I make sure everyone knows how to build one, so nobody else dies the way Silas did." Thad nodded, looking back out at the landscape. "That's what I thought you'd say." The roof came last. Elspeth had designed it as a cone steep enough to shed snow wide enough to overhang the platforms by 4 feet on all sides. The rafters radiated from a central point, the chimney's peak, and descended to the tower's outer edge at a 45-degree angle. She cut 18 rafters from pine, notched them to accept the ridge beam, and began assembly on the ground. The metal cap she'd forged for the chimney top sat waiting 4 vent holes, allowing smoke to escape, a conical shape that would prevent downdrafts and rain infiltration. She'd burnished it until the iron shone dark and smooth. Raising the roof required Thad's help and 2 full days of careful work. They lifted the central assembly first, the chimney cap and ridge beam locked together, and set it in place atop the chimney. Then they added rafters one at a time, attaching them to the ridge beam and securing them to the tower's outer posts. The geometry had to be perfect, or the roof would leak, would sag, would fail under snow load. On the second day, as they were securing the final rafter, dark clouds built on the western horizon. Thunder rolled across the grassland, and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and ozone. Elspeth looked at the approaching storm. "We need to finish the shingles." Thad looked at the sky, at the incomplete roof that would protect nothing in its current state. "That storm's going to hit in less than an hour. Then we work fast." They laid shingles in overlapping rows, starting at the bottom edge and working upward, nailing each one in place with quick, efficient strikes. The wind grew stronger, bending the grass flat, sending dust devils spinning across the clearing. Ember retreated to the cabin, watching from the doorway. The first raindrops hit when they were 3/4 finished, large, cold drops that struck like thrown stones. Lightning forked across the sky, and thunder followed close enough to feel in the chest. Elspeth kept working, her hands moving on instinct, placing shingles and driving nails, while the storm built around them. Thad matched her pace, the two of them racing the weather, trying to complete a roof before the rain became a downpour. They finished the final row as the sky opened up. Water came down in sheets, soaking them instantly, turning the ground to mud. Elspeth and Thad descended the spiral staircase, water running down the steps, making the treads slippery. They reached the ground and ran for the cabin, Ember barking from the doorway. Inside, they stood dripping on the floor, breathing hard, watching through the window as lightning lit up the tower. The rain hammered the new roof water, running off the shingles in streams channeled away from the platforms and the chimney. The structure stood solid against the wind that bent trees and sent loose objects tumbling across the clearing. No creaking, no swaying, just a tower built to last, holding its ground against the storm's fury. Thad leaned against the wall, water dripping from his hair. "You built something permanent, Elspeth. Something that's going to outlast both of us." She looked at the tower through the rain-streaked window. Good. That's what Silas would have wanted. The storm passed after midnight, leaving the sky clear and star-filled. Elspeth walked out to inspect the tower by moonlight, Ember padding beside her. She climbed the spiral staircase, checking each level, looking for damage or weakness. Everything held. The brackets were solid. The platforms were level. The roof had shed water exactly as designed. At the top platform, she stood looking out over the valley, over grassland silver in the moonlight, over the place where Silas was buried, over the future she was building from the ruins of the past. Fire needs three things: fuel, air, and height. She'd built the height. Come autumn, she'd fill it with fuel. And when winter came, when the blizzards returned and the cold tried to kill everything that couldn't find warmth, this tower would prove that loss could be transformed into survival, that one woman's grief could become a whole valley's salvation. Ember barked once from the ground, and Elspeth climbed down to join her, walking back to the cabin through grass that smelled like rain and new beginnings. September arrived with the first hint of autumn in the air. Mornings cold enough to see breath, afternoons still warm, but lacking summer's conviction. Elspeth began the work of filling the tower, starting with the bottom platform, where green wood would enter the drying cycle. She'd spent the last weeks of August felling timber and hauling logs to the clearing building, a reserve that now lay stacked behind the cabin in rough piles waiting to be split and organized. The axe work fell into rhythm. Set a log on the chopping block, raise the blade, swing. The wood separated with a crack that echoed across the grassland. Ember sat nearby, watching each swing, occasionally chasing chips that flew from particularly clean splits. The pile of split firewood grew steadily: oak and pine and cottonwood, each species chosen for specific burning properties. Oak for overnight coals that held heat through the dark hours. Pine for quick hot fires that drove morning chill from the cabin. Cottonwood for the in-between times when you needed flame, but not intensity. She carried the first armload up the spiral staircase, testing the treads under the burden of split wood and her own weight. The stairs held without complaint. At the bottom platform, she began stacking logs, placed bark side down, arranged in rows with air gaps between them to allow circulation. The platform could hold 4 cords if she stacked efficiently, and she worked with the precision her father had taught her, each piece positioned to maximize both capacity and drying potential. By noon, she'd moved half a cord onto the platform. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Climb down, gather wood, climb up, stack, repeat. Her shoulders burned and her hands ached, but there was satisfaction in watching the platform fill in, seeing potential energy stored against the winter that would inevitably come. Thad arrived in the afternoon, dismounting without announcement and joining the work as if they'd planned it. He carried wood up the western side of the staircase while Elspeth worked the eastern approach, the two of them passing each other on the platforms, coordinating without words. By evening, they'd loaded 2 full cords onto the bottom level, and Elspeth climbed to check the arrangement. The logs sat in neat rows, already beginning their transformation. She placed a hand on the closest piece, still heavy with moisture, the weight of sap and water trapped in cellular structure. But the wood felt warmer here than it would in any shed or outdoor pile. The chimney ran through the platform's center, and even without a fire burning in the cabin below, residual heat from the bricks radiated outward. Thad stood beside her, looking at the stacked wood. How long before this dries enough to burn? In a regular woodshed, 6 months minimum. Here with the chimney heat. Once I start burning fires regularly, maybe 10 weeks, maybe less. That's a significant difference. That's survival instead of rationing. That's making it to spring instead of burning furniture in March. They descended together as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the grassland gold and amber. At the base of the tower, Thad paused, his hand resting on one of the support posts. "I've been thinking about building something similar. Smaller scale, just 1 platform maybe. Would that work?" Elspeth looked up at the tower, at the 3 levels wrapped around the chimney like rings around a finger. Scale it to your needs. Measure your chimney. Calculate your winter fuel requirements, build accordingly. The principle stays the same regardless of size. Would you help? Not build it for me, but advise. Of course. Come by when you're ready to start. I'll show you the calculations. Thad mounted his horse but didn't immediately ride away. You've changed something in this valley, Elspeth. People are watching what you do, learning from it. Good. The more who build smart, the fewer who freeze. He rode off into the gathering dark, and Elspeth returned to the cabin where Ember waited by the cold fireplace. She built a small fire just enough to drive the evening chill away, and watched smoke rise through the chimney through the tower's hollow center, out the vented cap at the peak. The system worked exactly as designed. October brought the serious work of filling the middle and upper platforms. Elspeth had been splitting wood since dawn, and now she carried seasoned logs from last year's cutting wood that had spent 12 months drying in open air and was ready for the final stage of preparation. These pieces went to the middle platform positioned where rising heat would finish what time had started. She made a dozen trips up the spiral staircase, each load lighter than the green wood but still substantial. At the middle platform she stacked with the same care, maintaining air gaps, ensuring even weight distribution. The platform held steady under the growing load. When the middle level was half full, she climbed to the top platform with a thermometer she'd ordered from a catalog in Cheyenne. The mercury read 72 degrees, 15 degrees warmer than the ambient air temperature at ground level. And this was without a fire burning below. Once winter came and she kept flames going continuously, this platform would stay warm enough to accelerate drying beyond anything she'd calculated. She placed a piece of last year's wood on the platform floor, marking it with chalk. Tomorrow she'd check it again, measure any change in weight, calculate the drying rate. Science married to necessity theory proven through observation. Thad had started visiting more frequently, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, ostensibly to discuss his own tower plans, but staying longer each visit, helping with work that didn't require help, lingering over coffee that grew cold while they talked. Elspeth noticed, but said nothing. Grief had strange timelines, and whatever was building between them felt fragile enough that naming it might break it. They sat on the cabin's front step one evening in mid-October, the tower rising behind them like a lighthouse on a grassland sea. Ember lay between them, content to absorb attention from both directions. "Tell me about your wife." Thad looked at his hands, weathered and scarred from years of work. Her name was Catherine. Kate, mostly. Came west with her parents in '79. Met her at a church social in Laramie. She laughed at everything, I mean everything. Spilled coffee, broken eggs, horses that wouldn't cooperate. She'd just laugh and start over. What happened? Pregnancy complications. The baby came early, too early. Kate bled and the doctor couldn't stop it. Lost them both the same night. His voice stayed level, practiced at carrying this story without breaking under its weight. I buried them on the hillside facing east because Kate loved mornings, loved watching the sun come up, said it proved the world kept trying even when things went wrong. Elspeth stroked Ember's head, the dog's fur soft under her fingers. Do you still talk to her? To the grave every Sunday? Tell her about the week, about the weather, about what's growing or dying or changing? Don't know if she hears. Don't know if it matters. Silas's grave sits behind the barn. I haven't been there since the burial. Thad looked at her, no judgment in his expression. Everyone grieves different. No right way to carry it. I carry it by building, by making sure his death means something. Thad nodded. That's harder work than talking to headstones, but probably more useful. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars emerged. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled and Ember's ears perked up, but the dog didn't move from her spot between them. Inside, later alone except for Ember, curled by the banked fire, Elspeth pulled out the journal she'd been keeping since Silas died. Pages of calculations and observations, sketches of the tower from different angles, notes about wood drying rates and heat distribution patterns. But tonight, she wrote something different. Thad asked if I still talk to Silas. I don't. But I think Silas would have liked him. Would have appreciated a man who helps without being asked, who sees the work that needs doing and does it. Would have trusted him to take care of the things Silas can't anymore. The horses, the fence, repairs, the woman he left behind. She closed the journal and placed it on the shelf next to her father's old carpentry manual, the pages worn soft from years of use. November arrived cold and early. The first hard freeze came on the 3rd, killing what remained of the garden and coating the grass in white that didn't melt until afternoon. Animals began their preparations, birds flying south in formations that darkened the sky, deer moving to lower elevations, rabbits growing thick winter coats. Elspeth checked the tower daily now, inspecting brackets and beams, testing the staircase's stability, measuring the wood on each platform. The bottom-level logs that had been green in September were noticeably lighter, their moisture content dropping as chimney heat pulled water vapor from the cellular structure. The middle platform held wood ready to burn, and the top platform was nearly full of fuel so dry it felt hollow when handled. She built fires more frequently now, not just for warmth, but to accelerate the drying process. Smoke rose through the tower's center, and the platforms grew warmer, creating a vertical oven that seasoned wood faster than any amount of air and time alone could manage. But the comfort of preparation couldn't quite overcome the unease that grew with each passing day. The signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them. Aspen leaves falling 2 weeks earlier than usual, squirrels gathering food with frantic intensity, the peculiar stillness that preceded major weather systems. Old-timers in town spoke of the winter of '67 when temperatures dropped to 40 below and stayed there for a month when livestock froze standing in their barns and people burned furniture to survive. This winter felt like it carried the same potential for catastrophe. On November 20th, Elspeth noticed something wrong with the tower. She'd climbed to the top platform to rotate some of the stacked wood when she saw fresh saw marks on one of the spiral staircase supports, not the weathering of age but deliberate cuts angled to weaken the structure while leaving it standing. Someone had climbed up during the night and partially severed the support beam where it attached to the platform. Ember stood at the base of the tower looking up, whining. The dog knew something was wrong even if she couldn't articulate what. Elspeth descended carefully, testing each step before committing her weight, and examined the damage in better light. The cuts were clean, made with a sharp saw positioned where they'd be least visible from the ground. Another few days of regular use and the beam would have failed completely, sending anyone on that section of stairs tumbling 12 feet to hard earth. She found boot prints in the soft soil on the tower's north side, large prints a man's size fresher than Thad's last visit, the same prints she'd found after the bracket sabotage in July. This time she didn't stay silent. She rode into town that afternoon, Ember in the saddle behind her, and found Cyrus Whitmore at his workshop, hammering iron into shape for a gate commission. He looked up as she dismounted, his expression carefully neutral. "Someone's been sabotaging my tower. Cut one of the staircase supports last night. Same person who filed down my bracket bolts in July." Cyrus set down his hammer, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Blackwood. You have proof: boot prints, saw marks, pattern of damage designed to look like structural failure instead of sabotage. Could be anyone. Lots of people have been watching your project. Not all of them approve." Elspeth stepped closer, close enough to see the small cut on his right hand, fresh, the kind a man might get if a saw blade slipped during hasty nighttime work. "You offered to take over the project. I refused. Now someone's trying to make it fail so you can ride in and fix it properly." Cyrus's jaw tightened. "I don't need to sabotage your work, Mrs. Blackwood. It'll fail on its own because you don't have the experience to build something that complex. When it does, when someone gets hurt, don't come crying to me about it. If someone gets hurt because of sabotage, I'll know exactly where to come." She mounted her horse and rode back to the homestead. Ember pressed against her back, the dog's warmth a small comfort against the cold certainty that someone wanted her to fail badly enough to risk killing her in the process. That evening she reinforced the damaged staircase support with iron brackets and additional timber overbuilding to the point where failure would require deliberate destruction rather than simple wear. She added brackets to other vulnerable points, worked past dark by lantern light, checked and rechecked every connection. Thad found her still working at midnight, his arrival announced by Ember's bark of recognition rather than alarm. "Saw your lights from my land. What's wrong?" she explained while continuing to work the sabotage, the confrontation, the reinforcements. Thad listened without interrupting, then picked up a hammer and helped her finish the job. When they were done, he stood looking at the tower silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "You need someone watching this place. Someone here who can stop this before it gets worse. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering." Thad brought his bedroll the next night and slept in the barn close enough to hear anyone approaching the tower, but far enough to preserve propriety that the neighbors would insist mattered. Elspeth didn't argue. The valley was small enough that reputation affected survival, and a widow living alone with a widower would generate talk that could turn neighborly cooperation into isolation. But she appreciated the protection, appreciated knowing someone else understood the stakes. The first snow came on November 28th, light flurries that melted on contact with the still warm ground. But the sky held a gray weight that promised heavier weather to come, and the temperature dropped 5 degrees overnight, then 5 more the following night. Elspeth finished loading the tower on the last day of November 20. Cords total spread across 3 platforms, more fuel than she could burn in 6 months, even if she kept fires roaring day and night. The top platform held wood so dry it felt like holding air pieces that would ignite instantly and burn hot and clean. The middle platform held transition fuel ready within days. The bottom platform held green wood that would season over the winter and be ready by March when supplies traditionally ran low. She stood at the top platform on that final day of November, looking out over a landscape stripped of color, reduced to browns and grays, and the approaching white of winter. The valley spread out below individual homesteads marked by columns of smoke rising from chimneys where families burned what fuel they had and hoped it would last. Thad climbed up to join her, breathing hard from the ascent. "It's ready. Whatever winter brings, you're ready. We're ready. You helped build this as much as I did." He looked at her with an expression she'd seen growing more frequent. Something between admiration and affection, both kept carefully in check. "Elspeth, I need to tell you something." She waited, the wind pulling at her hair, the tower solid beneath her feet. "I came here to help because you needed it, stayed because the work was interesting. But that's not why I keep coming back now." The words hung in the cold air between them, and Elspeth felt something shift in her chest. Fear and possibility tangled together like roots in frozen ground. Before she could respond, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow, and they both looked west, where darkness gathered on the horizon like a physical thing approaching. Storm coming. They descended the tower together, secured loose items around the homestead, brought Ember inside. Thad stayed in the barn as the first real snowfall of the season began, flakes coming down thick and fast, accumulating on the grass that had been visible an hour before. By dawn on December 1st, 6 inches covered the ground and more was falling. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees and the wind howled across the grassland, piling drifts against anything that offered resistance. The tower stood firm, its conical roof shedding snow as designed, the spiral staircase still accessible despite the weather. Elspeth built a fire in the cabin's hearth and climbed the tower to test access during active snowfall. The stairs were slippery but manageable, the handrail she'd installed providing grip. At the top platform, she grabbed an armload of dry wood, descended, and was back inside the cabin within 90 seconds, door-to-door wood acquired exposure to killing cold minimized. The fire caught instantly when she added the seasoned fuel flames, leaping up bright and hot. Within minutes, the cabin's temperature rose from barely tolerable to genuinely warm. She fed the fire again, burning wood freely, because she had 20 cords in reserve and winter had only just begun. This was what she'd built toward this moment when preparation met necessity and proved itself worthy. The storm intensified over the next 3 days. Snow fell continuously, the wind never dropping below 30 miles per hour, visibility reduced to nothing beyond the cabin's frost-covered windows. Temperature plunged to 20 below, on the second night cold enough that breathing hurt. That metal burned skin on contact that any exposure longer than minutes could kill. Elspeth kept the fire burning, climbing the tower 3 times daily to retrieve wood, never spending more than 2 minutes outside. The cabin stayed warm, 70 degrees during the day. 65 overnight, comfortable enough that she worked in shirt sleeves and embers sprawled by the hearth instead of burrowing under blankets. On the 3rd day, she looked out the window toward where Thad's homestead should be visible and saw nothing but white. No smoke from his chimney, no signs of life. The snow had drifted deep enough to bury fences, and the wind showed no signs of stopping. She pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped her face against the cold, and fought her way to the barn. Thad met her halfway. His own face covered his movements, slow with cold. Inside the barn, they both pulled down their scarves, breathing hard. "Your chimney. I can't see smoke. Woodshed drifted shut yesterday morning. By the time I dug it out, everything inside was soaked. Been trying to dry logs by the stove, but wet wood won't burn worth a damn." His voice was rough, his fingers stiff when he pulled off his gloves. "Come to the cabin. I have dry wood. More than enough." Thad shook his head. "People will talk, Elspeth. Widow and widower under the same roof during a storm. People will talk about finding your frozen body when this storm breaks. Get your things." She didn't wait for his agreement, just walked back into the storm toward the cabin. After a moment, Thad followed, carrying the blankets and supplies he'd brought to the barn 3 weeks ago when he'd first started keeping watch. Inside, the warmth hit like a physical force. Thad stood dripping snow onto the floor, his face going from white to red as feeling returned to frozen skin. Elspeth added wood to the fire, the dry fuel catching immediately, heat pouring into the space. Thad removed his coat with shaking hands. "Your tower works." The words came out thick with emotion that had nothing to do with cold. "Yes, it works." He sank into the chair by the fire, ember pressing against his legs, sharing warmth. Elspeth made coffee, boiling water on the stove, the familiar ritual grounding both of them in the present moment. They sat in silence while the storm raged outside, and the fire burned steady inside, and the tower that had seemed so strange 6 months ago proved itself more valuable than gold. The storm didn't break until the evening of the 4th day. The wind died first, then the snow tapered to flurries, then stopped entirely. The sky cleared to crystalline black stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The temperature dropped further in the sudden calm, 30 below, colder than Elspeth had ever experienced. She and Thad stood outside in the shocking cold breath, freezing instantly, looking at a landscape transformed. Snow had drifted to the cabin's eaves on the north side, buried the fence, completely created an alien geography of white dunes and valleys. The tower rose from the white sea like a monument, its spiral staircase still partially clear, its roof perfectly intact. "We need to check on the neighbors." Thad looked at her, his face serious in the starlight. "That's dangerous, Elspeth. Visibility's good now, but another storm could come through. If we get caught between homesteads, then we move fast. But we move. Because if our woodshed had drifted shut instead of yours, I'd want someone to come." They loaded a sledge with dry firewood from the tower ember, harnessed to pull it, and set out across the frozen landscape. The snow was hard-packed from the wind supporting their weight, but each step required care. Falling here, breaking an ankle, or worse, would mean death. The first homestead they reached belonged to Prudence and Thomas Ashford. Smoke trickled from their chimney, barely visible in the cold air. Elspeth pounded on the door, and Thomas opened it, his face haggard. Inside the cabin was barely warmer than outside. A small fire smoldered in the hearth, giving off more smoke than heat, and Prudence sat wrapped in every blanket they owned, shivering. "Our wood was too green. Won't burn hot enough to drive the cold back." Elspeth unloaded half the sledge, carrying the dry fuel inside. She rebuilt their fire properly, adding the seasoned wood piece by piece until flames roared and actual heat began to fill the space. Prudence wept, the sound raw and grateful. "We were going to freeze. Another night and we'd have frozen." Thomas gripped Elspeth's arm, his eyes wet. "Thank you. God, thank you." The second homestead was old Widow Gunnarson's place, a mile beyond the Ashfords. No smoke rose from her chimney. The door was locked from inside. Thad put his shoulder to it, breaking the latch, and they stumbled into a cabin colder than a meat locker. Widow Gunnarsson lay on her bed unconscious, her skin gray, her breathing so shallow it was barely detectable. Elspeth felt for a pulse present but weak. Frostbite had blackened the old woman's fingers and toes, and her lips were blue. "We need to get her warm. Fast." They built a fire with the remaining wood from the sledge, stoking it until heat poured from the hearth. Thad wrapped Widow Gunnarsson in blankets while Elspeth heated water in filled containers to place around the old woman's body, trying to raise her core temperature without shocking her system. For an hour they worked, and for an hour Widow Gunnarsson remained unconscious, her breathing unchanged. Elspeth was preparing to suggest they transport her back to the Blackwood cabin when the old woman's eyes opened. "Angels." Her voice was a whisper, confused and frightened. "Not angels, just neighbors. You're going to be fine, Mrs. Gunnarsson." The old woman's eyes focused on Elspeth's face, recognition dawning slowly. "You came through the storm. For me. For everyone. That's what people do. They take care of each other." But Widow Gunnarsson's hand, frost-bitten and clumsy, reached out to grip Elspeth's wrist. "You saved my life. I was ready to go. Saw my husband waiting in the light. But you brought me back." Tears ran down the old woman's weathered cheeks. "Not your time, Mrs. Gunnarsson. Winter's not done with any of us yet." They stayed until Widow Gunnarsson was stable, her core temperature rising, her breathing normalized. Then they made the journey back to the Blackwood homestead through cold so intense it made thinking difficult. Inside her own cabin, finally, Elspeth and Thad collapsed by the fire, exhausted beyond measure. Ember curled between them, the dog's presence a comfort they both needed. Thad spoke first, his voice rough. "You built that tower to save yourself, but it saved all of us tonight. That's what Silas would have wanted, for his death to mean something, to prevent others from dying the same way." She looked at the fire, at the flames consuming wood that had spent months drying in the tower's rising heat. "Tomorrow I'm going to show everyone who wants to learn how to build one. Give them the calculations, the plans, everything. No charge, no conditions, just information that keeps people alive." Thad reached out and took her hand, the gesture simple and profound. "That's why I love you, Elspeth. Not because you survived, because you decided survival wasn't enough, that it had to mean more." The words settled between them like snow falling, transforming the landscape of what they'd been to each other into something new. She didn't pull her hand away. "I'm not ready yet, Thad. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. But I'm not sending you away either. I'll wait, or I won't. But I'm here either way." They sat together while the fire burned and the temperature outside dropped further, and somewhere in the darkness, Cyrus Whitmore huddled in his own cabin, burning wet wood, and regretting every choice that had brought him to this moment of cold isolation. The next morning brought visitors. Thomas Ashford arrived first, asking questions about tower construction, dimensions, materials, techniques. Then came neighbors Elspeth barely knew, drawn by stories of the storm rescue, wanting to see the structure that had made it possible. She showed them everything, walked them through the calculations, explained the heat circulation principles, demonstrated how the stacked wood dried from the center outward. Some took notes, others just listened, memorizing details they'd need later. By noon, 5 families had committed to building their own versions before the next major storm. By evening, 3 more had joined them. The tower design was spreading not through marketing or salesmanship, but through the simple recognition that it worked, that preparation mattered, that innovation born from loss could save lives. Prudence Ashford approached Elspeth as the sun set, her expression carrying something between gratitude and shame. "I was wrong about you, about the tower, about everything. I thought you were building some crazy monument to grief. But you built something that matters, something that saves people." Elspeth looked at the tower, at its spiral staircase and conical roof, and the smoke rising from her chimney through its hollow center. "Grief can poison you, or it can fuel you. I chose fuel." Prudence nodded. then did something unexpected. She pulled Elspeth into an embrace, the kind of hug that acknowledged debt beyond words. "Thank you. For my life. For my husband's life. For showing all of us there's a better way." When the last visitor left and darkness settled over the valley, Elspeth climbed the tower one final time, ascending to the top platform where the driest wood waited. She stood looking out over the snow-covered landscape, over the homesteads where families slept warm tonight, because she'd shared what she'd learned over the future she was building from the ruins Silas had left behind. Fire needs three things: fuel, air, and height. She'd given the valley all three, and watching the transformation spread homestead by homestead, family by family, felt like redemption for every moment of grief, every hour of doubt, every night spent wondering if Silas's death would ever mean anything beyond loss. Below in the cabin, Thad fed the fire, and Ember dozed, and the warmth they'd created together filled the space with possibility. Winter was far from over. But they were ready. January 1887 brought cold that redefined what human beings could endure. The temperature dropped to 35 below zero on the 6th and stayed there for 12 consecutive days, a cold snap that killed livestock standing in their barns and froze water pipes solid 6 feet underground. The sky remained crystalline blue throughout, empty of clouds, offering no insulation between Earth and the infinite cold of space. Elspeth's tower proved itself beyond any remaining doubt. She burned through 3 cords during those 12 days, keeping the cabin at a constant 70 degrees, climbing the spiral staircase 3 times daily to retrieve fuel that ignited instantly and burned so hot the chimney glowed red at night. The remaining 17 cords sat ready on the platforms, more than enough to last through March, even if the cold never broke. But the valley's other homesteads suffered catastrophically. Families who'd built small tower versions after the December storm survived reasonably well. Those who'd delayed or dismissed the design found themselves burning furniture and fence posts, rationing fuel, evacuating children to warmer households when their own became uninhabitable. On the 8th day of the cold snap, Thomas Ashford arrived with his wife Prudence and their 3 children, their faces white with exposure despite the short journey. "Our chimney cracked. Can't keep fire going without smoking ourselves out. Can we?" Before he finished, Elspeth was opening the door wider. "Get inside. All of you." The Ashford family crowded into the cabin, bringing the total occupancy to 7 humans and 1 dog. Elspeth added wood to the fire, made coffee and soup, distributed blankets. The children, 2 boys and a girl, ages 6 to 11, sat close to the hearth, their small hands extended toward heat they'd been denied for days. Thad arrived an hour later, having seen the Ashfords' dark homestead and correctly guessed where they'd gone. He brought dried meat and cornmeal from his own supplies, contributing to the communal survival effort the cold had forced upon them. "This is the warmest I've been in a week." Prudence's voice carried wonder and exhaustion in equal measure. "How much wood do you have left?" 17 cords. "More than enough for all of us." The family stayed 3 days, sleeping on the floor in shifts, sharing meals prepared on the stove that Elspeth fed without concern for conservation. On the 3rd day, Thomas worked with Thad to repair the Ashfords' chimney using mortar Elspeth heated to prevent freezing, and the family returned home to a structure that could once again hold fire safely. But they weren't the last refugees. Old Widow Gunnarsson came on day 10, transported by neighbors who feared she wouldn't survive another night alone. 2 other families arrived on day 11, their fuel exhausted, their children crying from cold that had penetrated walls never designed for this level of assault. Elspeth coordinated the shelter operation with calm efficiency, assigning sleeping spaces, organizing meal preparation, maintaining the fire that kept 12 people alive in a cabin built for 2. The tower never failed, the wood never ran out, the warmth never faltered. On the morning of day 13, the temperature rose to 0, still brutally cold but survivable, a heat wave by comparison. By afternoon it reached 10 above, and people began returning to their own homesteads carrying dry wood. Elspeth insisted they take rebuilding fires in chimneys that had gone cold. The valley had survived the worst cold snap in recorded history with 0 deaths. Not a single person lost to exposure or hypothermia or the desperate choices freezing people made when warmth became more valuable than food. Prudence Ashford stopped at the door before leaving her children already outside. "You saved our lives. All of us. I don't know how to build a tower. Teach your neighbors how to build towers. That's payment enough." After the last family departed, Elspeth and Thad stood alone in the cabin that suddenly felt enormous. Ember sprawled by the fire, exhausted from 12 days of constant human presence. Thad moved to the window, looking out at the tower that rose against the winter sky. "You did something extraordinary. Not just building it, sharing it." He turned to face her, and the expression on his face held certainty, instead of the careful hesitation she'd grown accustomed to. "I can't wait anymore, Elspeth. I love you. I want to build a life with you. Not because you need protection or because I'm lonely. Because you're the strongest person I've ever known, and I want to be part of whatever you build next." The words should have frightened her, should have felt like betrayal of Silas's memory, like moving too fast, like any of the things widows were supposed to feel when men proposed remarriage. But standing in the warmth her innovation had created, surrounded by evidence that grief could transform into something life-giving, Elspeth felt only relief. "Yes." Thad blinked, clearly expecting more resistance. "Yes, Silas told me before he died. Not that night, but weeks earlier when he first got sick. He said, 'Don't stop building. Don't stop creating. Don't let his death be the end of things.'" She crossed to where Thad stood, close enough to see the ice crystals in his beard beginning to melt in the cabin's heat. "You help me build. You see what needs doing and you do it. That's what I need. That's what Silas would want for me." Thad pulled her close, and they stood together while Ember watched with what looked suspiciously like approval, and the fire burned steady, and the tower outside stood as silent witness to promises being made and kept. They married in June beneath the tower's spiral staircase, the conical roof providing shade from afternoon sun. 15 neighbors attended, including Prudence and Thomas Ashford with their children. Widow Gunnarsson moving slowly but alive, and even Cyrus Whitmore, who stood at the back looking uncomfortable but present. Elspeth wore a dress she'd sewn from fabric Thad had bought in Cheyenne, simple and practical, suitable for a woman who'd be back at work the next morning. Thad wore his cleanest shirt and the expression of a man who'd been given something he'd stopped believing possible. The ceremony was brief. No elaborate vows, no unnecessary decoration. Just two people promising partnership in a place that symbolized survival through innovation, grief transformed into something useful. Afterward, Thad moved his belongings from his own homestead to Elspeth's cabin, the one with the tower attached, the one that was warmer and better designed. They began planning expansions immediately, additional rooms for the children who would inevitably come a larger workspace for the projects Elspeth envisioned. But the tower remained untouched, the central feature around which everything else would be built. Spring brought visitors from territories Elspeth had never seen. Men and women traveled from Montana, Colorado, Idaho, even as far as eastern Oregon, drawn by stories of the tower that had kept an entire valley alive through the coldest winter in memory. They arrived with notebooks and measuring tapes, asking questions about materials and techniques, sketching diagrams they'd take home and attempt to replicate. Elspeth spent entire days teaching the same information repeatedly: post-placement platform construction, the mathematics of heat circulation. By May, she'd explained the tower's principles to over 50 people. By July, more than 100 visitors had made the journey to see it firsthand. Thad watched her exhaustion grow as she gave the same lesson for the 15th time in a single week. "You need to teach them all at once. Open a school. Make it formal. A school for carpentry." "That's not, why not? You have the knowledge. They need the education. Stop treating it like individual favors and make it institutional." The idea took root, slowly growing through the summer as more visitors arrived, and Elspeth's time became consumed by teaching rather than building. By autumn, she'd sketched plans for a dedicated school building, a structure large enough to hold 20 students, equipped with workbenches and tools, and space for both theoretical instruction and practical application. The Blackwood Building School opened in April 1889. In a timber frame building, Elspeth and Thad had spent the winter constructing on land adjacent to their homestead. The first class enrolled 12 students, 8 men and 4 women ranging in age from 17 to 46. The mix was controversial from the start. The mayor of the nearest settlement rode out to express concerns. Mrs. Mercer teaching men and women together in a technical field, that's not how things are done. Elspeth, 6 months pregnant with her first child, stood straighter. Things weren't done by building towers around chimneys either. But people who build towers don't freeze. So maybe it's time to reconsider how things are done. The mayor left unconvinced but unwilling to fight a woman whose innovation had saved lives, whose reputation had spread across 5 territories, whose students were already arriving with tuition money and serious commitment. The curriculum Elspeth developed covered mathematics, structural engineering, materials science, and practical construction. Students learned to calculate load-bearing capacity, design ventilation systems, work metal and wood with equal proficiency. They built scale models, then full-size structures, each project increasing in complexity. Cyrus Whitmore appeared at the school one morning in late May, his hat in his hands. "I know I don't deserve consideration. Know what I did trying to sabotage your work. But I also know you're a better teacher than I'll ever be, and I'm begging to work here. No pay, just the chance to learn from you and make up for being a fool." Elspeth studied him for a long moment. The students had paused their work watching the exchange. 3 years. Unpaid labor. You teach what you know to the students, but you learn from me. You question my methods or undermine my authority once and you're gone permanently. Cyrus nodded, relief washing over his weathered face. 3 years. Thank you. He became the school's assistant instructor, teaching traditional construction methods, while Elspeth introduced innovations that challenged everything students thought they knew about building. His presence, a former skeptic now converted, added credibility to the program's radical approach. Ruth Mercer was born in October 1889, delivered by widow Gunnarsson, who'd learned midwifery in her youth and remembered enough to guide Elspeth through labor that lasted 14 hours. Thad paced outside while Ember whined at the closed door, and when widow Gunnarsson finally emerged with a red-faced, furious infant, Thad wept openly. "She's perfect. She's absolutely perfect." Elspeth held their daughter, exhausted and exhilarated, thinking about the future this child would inherit, a future where women built things, where innovation mattered more than tradition, where survival meant preparation instead of luck. The controversy came in autumn 1890 when the Colorado School of Mines, an all-male institution training engineers for the territory's mining operations, sent an inspector to evaluate the Blackwood Building School. Professor Edmund Carlisle arrived expecting to find amateur enthusiasm masquerading as education. He left 3 days later with notebooks full of observations and a fundamentally altered understanding of frontier innovation. His report to the Colorado School of Mines Board caused immediate uproar. "What Mrs. Mercer has accomplished in 18 months exceeds the practical education our students receive in 4 years of formal study. Her tower design demonstrates principles of thermodynamics and structural engineering that are being taught in European universities but have not yet reached American curricula. Her students, male and female, equally demonstrate competency that would qualify them for professional certification in any major city. To dismiss this program because it operates outside traditional academic structures would be to ignore the most significant educational innovation I have encountered in 20 years of teaching." The report circulated beyond its intended audience. Within a year, Carlisle had published a paper titled "Vernacular Engineering: What Formal Education Can Learn from Frontier Builders" that cited Elspeth's work extensively. The paper reached engineering departments in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago, bringing Elspeth a fame she'd never sought and didn't particularly want. But it validated the school, brought additional students, and forced skeptics to acknowledge that innovation could emerge from anywhere, even from a widow in Wyoming who'd turned grief into systematic education. Clara was born in 1891, Anna in 1893. The Mercer household expanded the cabin, growing room by room, but the tower remained its heart, still functional, still teaching, still proving that one person's response to tragedy could become a whole community's salvation. By 1895, the Blackwood Building School had graduated more than 200 students. They scattered across the Western Territories, building homes and barns and public structures carrying Elspeth's principles with them. Some introduced innovations of their own. A graduate named Josephine Sterling designed an underground root cellar system that used Earth's natural cooling to preserve food through summer heat. Marcus Webb created a wind-resistant barn design that could withstand Wyoming's notorious storms without losing roof shingles or suffering structural damage. Elspeth taught them to see building not as following blueprints, but as solving problems, each structure a unique response to specific environmental challenges. She refused to create students who merely copied her tower design. Instead, she trained people who understood the principles well enough to innovate beyond her original work. The school's philosophy, written in her own hand and posted in the main classroom, read, "I teach principles, not blueprints. Take what you learn here and build something better. That's how knowledge grows." Ember died in October 1894, old age claiming her peacefully by the fire she'd slept beside for 11 years. The golden retriever had been Silas's companion, Elspeth's witness through grief and rebuilding, the children's gentle playmate. They buried her in the clearing behind the cabin where morning sun reached first Thad digging the grave while Elspeth and the girls placed wildflowers around the small marker he'd carved. Ruth, now 5, asked the question that had been pressing at Elspeth's heart. Will we get another dog eventually, when we're ready? The puppy arrived a month later, a golden retriever like Ember, but with a white blaze on its chest. Ruth named her Spark, and the name felt appropriate for a dog that would grow up around the fire tower, around the school, around the warmth that defined the Mercer family's existence. The tower's repurposing began in 1898, when lightning struck a stand of cottonwoods 3 miles west, igniting a fire that consumed 50 acres before rain finally extinguished it. The valley organized a meeting to discuss fire prevention, and someone suggested using Elspeth's tower as a watchpost. It's the tallest structure for 20 miles. Someone at the top platform can see smoke from any direction. Elspeth considered the proposal. The tower still held firewood, still functioned perfectly for its original purpose, but the top platform could accommodate a person watching for danger. We'd need a lightning rod, and a bell to sound alarm, and someone willing to climb up there regularly during fire season. The modifications took a month. Elspeth forged a copper lightning rod herself, installing it at the tower's peak and grounding it deep in the earth. Thad hung a brass bell at the platform's edge, its tone carrying for miles when struck properly. The valley organized a rotation of volunteers who climbed the tower daily from June through September, watching for smoke ready to sound alarm. The tower became dual-purpose wood storage and winter fire watch in summer, and its utility expanded beyond what Elspeth had originally imagined. Structures didn't have to serve single functions. They could evolve, adapt, become whatever their community needed. In 1900, Clara, now 9 and precociously organized, compiled her mother's teaching notebooks into a coherent manuscript. The pages contained diagrams, calculations, observations from 15 years of building and teaching. Elspeth edited the material, adding theoretical framework to practical knowledge, creating something that could serve as both memoir and textbook. The Firekeeper's Manual was published by a small press in Cheyenne, initially printing 500 copies that sold out within 6 months. A second printing reached 2,000 copies. By 1905, the manual was being used in technical schools across 8 states. Elspeth's frontier innovations becoming formalized curriculum. She never saw royalties had released the material for publication cost, only wanting distribution over profit, but the impact exceeded anything money could measure. Young engineers read about heat circulation principles and tower construction. Architects studied her approach to environmental adaptation. Teachers used her methods to train the next generation of builders. Silas's death had created a legacy that touched thousands of lives he'd never meet in places he'd never see, through innovations he'd never imagined. Grief properly channeled could light fires that burned for generations. Thad died in April 1922, peacefully in his sleep at age 71. Elspeth woke to find him gone, his face calm, his hand still warm in hers. They'd had 35 years together, a long marriage by any standard, a good partnership by every measure that mattered. The funeral drew over 100 people, including graduates from the school's earliest classes, now middle-aged and accomplished in their own right. They came to honor a man who'd helped build something larger than himself, who'd supported his wife's work without resentment or competition, who'd understood that love sometimes meant standing aside and watching someone else shine. Elspeth was 64, still teaching, still running the school that now occupied 3 buildings and employed 5 instructors, including Cyrus Whitmore, who'd fulfilled his 3 years of penance and stayed for 26 more. Anna, her youngest daughter, had married a carpenter she'd met through the school. They lived on the homestead now, helping manage the expanding operation while Elspeth transitioned toward retirement. The school's evolution continued into the new century. In 1910, Elspeth added masonry and metalwork programs, recognizing that construction required multiple disciplines working in concert. By 1915, the school was accepting Native American students, a controversial decision that cost them some funding, but gained them students of exceptional talent and dedication. When Elspeth finally retired in 1920 at age 62, the school had graduated over 800 students. Cyrus and Anna took over daily operations, maintaining Elspeth's principles while adapting to changing construction methods and materials. The school had become an institution recognized across the western states, respected enough that its graduates found employment easily. Elspeth's great-granddaughter, Lillian Mercer, enrolled at MIT in 1925, one of 3 women in the engineering program. She faced hostility from professors and students alike, but she'd grown up hearing stories about her great-grandmother building a tower, while neighbors mocked her teaching students when authorities questioned her credentials, transforming an entire region's approach to survival. If Elspeth could do that in 1886, Wyoming Lillian could handle skeptical engineering professors in 1920s Boston. Her thesis, completed in 1929, was titled Heat Circulation in Vertical Wood Storage Systems, a Study of Passive Solar Engineering. It analyzed Elspeth's tower design using modern thermodynamic principles, demonstrating that frontier innovation had anticipated concepts that formal science was only now beginning to articulate. Lillian graduated with honors and became Montana's first licensed female structural engineer in 1935, designing bridges and public buildings, carrying forward the legacy her great-grandmother had initiated by refusing to accept that women couldn't build. The tower stood 43 years old when Elspeth climbed it for the last time in summer 1929. She was 71, moving more slowly than she once had, but still steady on the spiral staircase she'd built when she was 28 and broken by grief. Lillian climbed with her, the young woman who represented everything Elspeth had fought to make possible. At the top platform they stood together, looking out over a valley transformed. Where once there had been scattered homesteads and desperate survival, now there were established farms, the town grown to nearly 1,000 residents, the school's buildings visible in the distance. "You changed the world." "Grandmother." Elspeth shook her head. "I changed Wyoming. Silas changed me. You'll change more." She handed Lillian the original notebook's pages, yellowed with age but still legible, still valuable. "These are yours now, not to copy but to learn from, to see how one person responded to one problem and let that inspire how you respond to yours." Lillian held the notebooks like sacred texts. "The tower's going to be here long after I'm gone, isn't it?" "Probably. Wood rots and metal rusts, but good ideas last forever." They descended together, Lillian helping her great-grandmother downstairs that had held firm through 43 winters, and at the bottom Elspeth placed one hand on the central post, feeling the solid wood that had been green timber when Silas was newly dead, and she was newly determined. "Thank you." She spoke to the tower, to Silas, to the past that had shaped her future, to the grief that had become her greatest teacher. Elspeth Blackwood Mercer died in her sleep on a clear spring morning in 1931, 3 months shy of her 83rd birthday. She'd lived long enough to see her tower become a registered historical landmark, her school transform into Wyoming Technical College, her methods taught in universities across the country. Her daughters buried her next to Thad in the plot they'd chosen together, close enough to the tower that they could have touched it if they'd reached out their hands. Silas's grave was nearby, moved from behind the barn years earlier, so the family could rest together. The funeral drew over 300 people, including the governor of Wyoming, multiple engineering professors, and dozens of former students who credited Elspeth with changing their lives. They spoke of her generosity, her brilliance, her refusal to let tragedy define her. But the most meaningful tribute came from Lillian, who stood at the graveside and read from her great-grandmother's journal, the entry written that first night after Thomas Ashford had dismissed her tower idea as crazy. Fire needs three things: fuel, air, and height. Silas taught me this. Winter took him 15 feet from our door. I'm building something so no one else dies reaching for warmth that should be closer. If you're reading this later after I'm gone, remember the worst thing you can do with grief is nothing. Build something. Make loss mean something. Turn pain into warmth and warmth into legacy. The tower still stands, maintained now by the Historical Society, but still functional, still capable of storing and drying wood exactly as Elspeth designed. Engineering students visit annually, studying a structure that predated modern thermodynamics but understood its principles intuitively. Professors use it as teaching tool, demonstrating how observation and necessity can produce innovation that formal education takes decades to recognize. Most visitors don't know Elspeth's name, don't know about Silas freezing outside the barn, don't know about the December blizzard that proved the design, the January cold snap that saved a valley, the 43 years the tower stood as testament to what one grieving woman could accomplish when she decided survival wasn't enough. But they understand the principle. They see the logic. And sometimes, looking at their own lives and losses, they wonder what they could build if they were brave enough to start. In 2020, a structural engineering class at Montana State University studied Elspeth's original plans as part of a course on sustainable building practices. The professor displayed her sketches on a screen, the charcoal lines still visible after 134 years. This is Elspeth Blackwood's 1886 fire tower design. Before computer modeling, before formalized thermodynamics, she understood passive solar heating. Questions. A student raised her hand. Did she become famous? The professor smiled. She became necessary. There's a difference. Fame fades, necessity endures. Her tower still teaches us that grief doesn't have to be the end of things. That loss can become legacy if you're willing to build something from it. Fire needs three things: fuel, air, and height. Elspeth Blackwood learned that watching her husband freeze. She built something that still teaches us today, not just about staying warm, but about transforming pain into purpose, turning one woman's tragedy into 1,000 people's survival, and understanding that the best way to honor what we've lost is to build something that lasts.